Welcome to the next episode of learning more about Northern Italian culture and languages. Today we're joined by Claudio from Genova. Thank you for joining us, Claudio.
Hi, the pleasure is mine. Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind, just for our audience, Claudio, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and an introduction to your hometown, if you don't mind?
Very well. So my name is Claudio. You can call me Claude if it's easier. I'm a nurse as a profession. I've been living in London for almost 8 years now. But I was born in Santa Margherita Ligure in Liguria, which is inside the province, now metropolitan city of Genoa or Genoa. And I speak Genoese, particularly is a dialect of Genoese called Cicerino, which is basically an older version of the modern Genoese, but we still speak. And nothing. I also speak English, as you can hear, Italian, obviously, and occasionally I can speak a little bit of French and other languages, but which are very handy here in London, being multicultural city that it is. As a nurse, I always thought about the principle of obviously helping the people who are in need. And in the terms of our languages that we have in Northern Italy, I've applied more or less the same thing in a sense, because I like to speak it. I like to speak my language also because I like to look after it, for making sure that it doesn't get extinct or that it get passed on through the generations, really.
I really like that comparison between nursing and preserving languages. I don't think I've ever heard such a comparison, but it's absolutely accurate. I wish more people, not just in Geneva, not just Liguria, but around the world, had that attitude toward languages because, it's such an important part of history, regardless of where you come from. It could be applied to people speaking Irish in Ireland or Gaelic in
Yeah.
Scotland or obviously Ligurian in Liguria. If you would mind, Claudio, how depending on how comfortable you are with obviously Genovese, could you try and introduce yourself in Genovese if that's possible, please?
Yeah, I'll say my dialect. I'll tell you in advance, some purists or Genoese people from Genoa, they will say, oh, that my accents sound particular. But that's because, as I said at the beginning, I speak a particular accent from where I come from. But anyway, salut a tutti, mi chiamo Claudio, mi vengo da Ciché, che è in paese piccin da provincia di Siena. E niente, sono qui, ho 32 anni e faccio l'infermiere. This is, I would say, this is a brief introduction of myself, an introduction curta, we would say
Oh,
in
it's
the language.
lovely to hear that. If you don't mind, Claudio, just moving on to a slightly different question. With regards to the
So,
dialect in your home area, the province of Geneva, now the metropolitan city, um, can you explain the situation of a dialect in your area? Who speaks it? Do a lot of people still speak it, or is it mostly kind of confined to the elderly community?
that's a very interesting question, and the answer is much more complicated than what someone would think, because technically, everyone is really proud about their being Genoese and everything. Not only the locals, but also people who's got Genoese heritage, which I think is quite common anyway in the Italian identity. So many people will say, yes, of course, I speak Genoese, I am Genoese, I'm a Ligurian, because obviously this thing translates over to the rest of the region. But then when it's about speaking the language, many times we just fall off to just being able to speak a few words. So we need to make some levels here. So I don't know if you got a clear idea of the region of Liguria. So we got a very long, wide coast, and then a nice hinterland as well with tall mountains, very rural, contrary to the coast, which is very urbanized and especially Genoa and La Spezia, if we have to make two examples. So in the city, obviously, because of massive waves of internal immigration and external now as well, and Genoese has been, let's say, diluted a lot with Italian. So even people, you will get people from everywhere being able to speak it, but especially in the last generations, it has been lost a little bit. And as you were saying, mostly the elderly people will be speaking it. But as soon as you leave the city, you come over to our rural area, which is where I come from as well, more or less. The youngsters still speak very, very well the language and their own particular local dialects, but they will all know Genoese as well, because it's being always considered like the literary, the more elitist dialect, if you will, compared to the rest of the other dialects. And so would also be speaking it to each other. It happens to me all the time, every time I go back. And we're not just talking about like saying, oh, rural, therefore farmers and only, lower society level of people, but everyone of every social status and every age outside of Genoa and outside of La Spezia and the main cities that will be speaking it. So yeah, as I said, we could carry on talking about this for hours, but this is to really sum up the thing. So on the coast is losing itself a little bit, whereas on the countryside, the tradition and all these conservative forces, if you want, they allow the language to still be spoken and be preserved, which has helped me a lot as well in my little researches that I've been doing in these last years, I'd say.
That's really nice to hear. And just as a little aside for the audience, I think there's some similarities with Liguria and Piemonte. And what I mean by that is most of Liguria, consists of four provinces. You've got obviously Genova, La Spezia, Savona, and Imperia. But the culture, I feel, and historically, it's always been dominated by Genova. Similarly, in Piemonte, you've always had, to an extent at least, Turin dominating the whole region. But as you said, once you get out of the city, the landscape and just it becomes quite a rural area by and large. And of course, a lot of these traditions do kind of remain even in this modern age 2023. And that brings me to my next question. Talking about traditions, are there any traditions in your area that you like to get involved with, or any traditions you participate in yourself when you're back home?
Well, yes, I have to say, obviously now it gets a little bit more difficult being myself an immigrant, but there are local, obviously, where would be obviously Catholic in my area, mainly. So traditions, many times they're always linked to the Catholic belief. So if we talk about Genova, they have their own traditions, which are quite common and renowned in the rest of Liguria, obviously, again, for the same story. So we could have the celebration of the Confergu when the mayor of the city at the end of the year, let's say roughly at the beginning of the new year, they will make a big fire and then they will judge whether the next year will be favorable or not. There will be other small local saints that we celebrate. One famous thing that is going out of fashion again, it used to be, for instance, to say very literal, to carry huge crosses around the town, which is symbolical, but similarly to other realities like in the Palio di Siena in Tuscany or the regattas and or the fights. I think that there's another one in Pisa. It is always about like the local squares, the local families that will carry their own cross, there will be their own independent families that will run this. It's not a business, but as like tradition, and they will be really proud of that. Anciently, these people as well, they would have carried, for instance, funerary services. They would have done other rituals for the churches and help the priest and as well. So that will become a matter of local pride as well. Another tradition that is quite renowned, especially in the Levante, which is where I come from, so it's the eastern part of Liguria and of the province of Genoa, is the mascoli, or as we say in my dialect, mascheri, which is basically, it's like fireworks that they are basically to memorize the time that we used to be invaded by pirates, for instance, and you would obviously fight them back with mortars. And so we shoot these little mortars. The most famous one is in Rapallo, if you know the city. And so about the second half of July, they would explode these fires. But then obviously this culture has spread around in other churches as well. So like my local church used to do that as well. And the rhythm obviously of the explosions will also tell you the way you should be marching with your saint during the procession after mass, after the church. We could carry on a lot. There's one last one I want to mention. On the night of St. John, I don't know if this thing we copied it from the Irish, because I heard that I think there is a similar belief in Ireland, and also because my area was converted to Christianity by an Irish monk, a Benedictine monk named Saint Columbus, which is the night of St. John. We light on fires. But they saying, even though this is related to St. John, some sources are saying that this kind of celebration has got Celt origins. So we don't know if it's because the pre-Roman population of the area had this Celt influence, or if it was introduced by the Irish priests, the monks, pardon me, that came over and converted the place to Catholicism. So yeah, and during this celebration, in the entirety of Liguria, we used to play a horn made out of a seashell called ucorno or abornia, obviously depending on the area. And let's say, I don't want to bore you any longer with other stories, but I think these are some of the most famous, and this last one, which is less renowned and a bit more forgotten, I'd say, that is not even celebrated anymore, I think. But I'd like it to be restored again, because it must have been really fascinating to see every village lighting up a fire during the night for the night of St. John.
No, thank you for sharing all that information. It was really interesting. And I would just like to point out to people listening that Northern Italy is an area, and I would say Liguria is part of this kind of description, which has been historically very religious. If you were to look at the history of most of the popes, most of them, maybe come from Veneto or Lombardy. I'm not sure if there's been any Ligurian popes, but certainly a lot of important priests as well. However, rightly or wrongly, and for various reasons, the influence of the church, both on a local, national, and global level, has been declining in recent generations. That perhaps has also affected traditions. Whether people think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's up for them to decide. But the church used to be a huge part of the community, not just on Sundays, but also just in terms of navigating and arranging, cultural events, let's say. So it was really interesting hearing about how pivotal, let's say, the church was when it comes to orchestrating, cultural traditions that go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's interesting hearing that Celtic connection as well, because Liguria was obviously settled at least partly by the Liguri tribe. And there's a lot we don't really know about them, but they could be, quite influenced by the Celts. It's a really interesting connection between, Catholicism, Irish monks, and of course, the kind of Celtic horns and what have you, or similar horns that you get in kind of Celtic culture, perhaps. I think the most important question, Claudia, I'm going to leave for last, which is now. Obviously, you spoke with great pleasure about your dialect and the connection it has to your community. But what would you say if you had to describe the dialect? What does it mean to you?
The dialect for me, I also, by the way, I'll do a premise. Probably you heard this from other people as well. I like the idea of my dialect as a language, but I don't consider dialect as a negative thing. Other people will say, oh, because in Italy, when you say dialect, you automatically mean either that it's connected or derived from Italian, or that anyway is inferior to Italian. But I'm happy to use dialect anyway. It helps to distinguish, obviously, the local languages from the main official Italian language. But anyway, what does the dialect mean to me? It does mean a lot because for me, there are many things, obviously. Dialects are languages. Our dialects, especially, and all the other dialects in the north, they used to have we used to have a utilitaristic approach to them, right? So, for instance, in Liguria, Genoese will be very, very much used in the seafaring vocabulary. So it would have a very rich seafaring vocabulary. Even there were records, and there are, if you go, like, for instance, in South America, where many immigrants of Ligurian descent would have gone there, and they would have used their vocabulary in the riverfaring and seafaring, and still nowadays it has stuck in the local languages. And so it has happened with Italian, for instance. Italian has inherited a few words from Ligurian and from Genoese. One, for instance, is the term cliff, scoglio, technically comes from Genoese coggio, and not the opposite. Even there are some testimonies that would say that a word like anchovy the origin is shared in between Catalan anchova and the Genoese anchua, or anchuva, as it used to be said in the past. So for me, obviously this utilitaristic approach is started to dwindling a little bit, because obviously Italian is taken over. And the mentality of the people as well is that Ligurian is not useful anymore. So either we convert to English, but obviously most of the Italians nowadays, there's a lot of patriotism and national sentiment. So even English is becoming, people are becoming refractarian to English as well. So either we stick with Italian, they say, but to defend Italian, which according to certain mentalities is obviously, well, at least from their point of view, is menaced by both the dialects of the people who don't have any culture or anything, according obviously to the stereotypes, and English, which is an invasive language that is taking over everything, etc., etc. We end up with these languages which have lost this utilitaristic approach, and they're losing also the nostalgic facade that they used to have, because the generations that they used to actively speaking and listening to English, at least in the main cities, like we were saying before, are disappearing slowly, and they've been taken over by new generations of people which have been grown up by only speaking and listening to Italian broadcasts and medias, and sometimes English, like in my case, or French or whatever else. Therefore, the language for the people has lost a lot of meaning, and it has lost a lot of the language of Genoese, obviously. It has lost a lot of reasoning for them to keep on speaking it. For me, the contrary is, it has many, I've got many reasons, and it has many meanings for me. One of them, again, is the tradition. Even though I don't consider myself a very traditionalist or conservative person, I still believe that having your identity and your roots well solid onto, like, for instance, a proper and active knowledge of your own language helps a lot in growing yourself. So as an individual, I feel happier to know, for instance, a second language just by per se, and also knowing that it's my personal language. It is the language of my family, of my ancestors, and it has very nice and deep roots. Helps me a lot, even psychologically, in a certain sense. In another sense, then, if I go back to the utilitaristic approach, Italian, if we have to confront it again, Italian is a very independent language. For instance, it has got some influence from maybe French and Spanish, but then it has taken a very weird approach in the vocabulary. So if an Italian that has to switch to French, for instance, or Spanish, to say, will have a few more challenges than, for instance, a person who speaks, on average, a northern or even a southern dialect. Just to say a simple example, tomato in Italian is pomodoro. In the rest of Italy, when you use your own language, apart from a couple of exceptions, is tomata or pomata, which is obviously much closer to tomate, tomato, and so on. And this is just one example. So I'm not saying that, obviously, if you speak Genoese or Ligurian, therefore you automatically speak Spanish, Portuguese, and so on and so forth. But it's definitely, in my opinion, if you're into languages and you're Ligurian, speaking and learning Genoese properly is a nice way to get started for other languages. It's a matter, obviously, of pride as well, because speaking Genoese is the language of an ancient republic that has lasted almost 1,000 years. So for people are into history, and even though Genoese, again, we could spend another year talking about the way it has evolved from the Middle Age, but we got a nice literature that starts exactly from the 1200s in the Middle Age, and it has carried on until today. So again, Genoese for me and Ligurian means a lot. It means, if not everything, at least from the linguistic point of view, is an extra gear that I have in my gearbox, I believe, and I'm very happy about it. I'm happy to share it. I'm happy to teach it if I can, and also I'm also happy to learn it, because I also recognize some challenges and things that I still don't know myself, for instance. So yeah, that's it. I hope I did. I expressed my concept well, because I really expanded a lot.
Absolutely. And it's very refreshing to hear about. Obviously, you're educated, you're a nurse, you live in a foreign country, you still go back to your dialect and look toward it with such positive attitudes. Because as you said, and as I've certainly read a lot about and had conversations with people about, the Italian dialects have declined quite considerably. And
Yeah,
it's, I think, one of the biggest reasons is just due to the state not recognizing them, and also
absolutely.
associating the dialect with being poor and uneducated. And as you were saying, Genovese Republic's been, it lasted, over 1,000 years with so much literature in Genovese, and how can that be correct? That false assertion. But I think it's all part of a broader kind of narrative that does result in people taking less of an interest in a dialect. And if you have people like yourself who are very proud, that should at least play a small part in hopefully keeping it alive, at least for the next generation. That's my 2 cents, at least. What I was going to move on to, Claudia, is obviously just thanking you for your time today. And if you are involved in any projects that we would be interested in hearing about, by all means, please let us know. Are you involved in anything to do with the Ligurian language or projects in general right now?
So yeah, well, I'll just spend a couple of words about it. Yeah, because I do actually have a small, a few like YouTube channel, Instagram page, and Facebook, where I started broadcasting myself in small videos where I try to teach a few things about Genoese or things that I learned myself, and I like to teach back. And it's videos of a few seconds, sometimes maybe a minute and a half. And the page is called L'Anonimo Senese, okay, which means the Genoese Anonymous, which is a reference to the first real writer, author in Genoese from the Middle Age. And that's my little thing that I do personally. I started at the beginning as just a simple Facebook page a few years ago, and now it has become basically a Reels page, like a sort of a TikTok similar. And I try always to speak in Genoese only, and it has gathered a little bit of quite a nice success, I would say. I'm really happy about it. And another thing, I'm part of a small group. It's called the Conseggio, which is basically the Council for the Safeguarding of the Ligurian Language, which is basically a gather of a few other people, which together we are all into different markets, let's say, different sectors. So there will be poets, there will be authors, there people like me, like influencers, let's say, in brackets. And we support each other. We do always talk about the language, we talk about literature, we talk about initiatives, and we support each other. And so these are the two main things I do in terms of Genoese. So obviously, my main problem, because I don't live in Liguria anymore, the best way for me to educate the others is with the online participation more than with the physical one. The last thing I've done, obviously, because as I mentioned in the beginning, and then I'll let you go. I wrote also recently, and I published independently, a small book about my particular dialect, because as I said at the beginning, because of, as I said, I come from the inside of the hinterland of Liguria, there are some parts where the language hasn't evolved. If I had to make a comparison, it's like with British English, which it has taken its own kinds of evolution, and then you have Scots, which it has evolved differently from English, even though some people will say there is no real language, and there could be a debate that goes for centuries. In our case, though, we still call it Genoese, so I wouldn't call it a separate language. But we have a few differences which are quite key, and they make us quite distinct from the literary modern Genoese that we have nowadays. So I made a book about that because there is really a handful of people who speak it, maybe 10, 15 of us. And but the newer generations, the families that come from that place, they were really craving for something like this. And it's basically a book that I did for them. It's called La Lingua e la Cultura della Val Cichero, the language and the culture of Cichero Valley, which is this beautiful little valley in the eastern side of Liguria again. And nothing. I'm really proud of that work. I'm already after the writing of the second edition, because I've had a lot of good feedbacks, and I'm learning also myself a lot about how to improve it. And that's it. These are just, obviously, being myself a nurse, I've got very little time to do anything in general, but at least I managed to do something for my language and for my culture, and I hope I'm I'm getting something out of it in terms of maintaining the culture and the language for the generations to come. And that's it.
No, I commend you on being so active, especially being a nurse. You don't have much time on your side, but you're doing a lot for your community. So I'm definitely going to check your projects out myself personally, but also I'm going to leave some links in the description. So if anyone's interested, they can obviously support the work you and your fellow Ligurians are involved in. But I'd just like to close by saying it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. You're welcome back on anytime. And yeah, I cannot wait to visit the hinterlands of Liguria and hear people speak Ligurian live in person soon, hopefully.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated the interview. I'm looking forward to see you up in Liguria.
You take care, Claudio. Thank you.
Take care as well. Yeah, bye bye.